President Monti, would you like to take on to the podium now as well? Thank you very much for a follow-up address. That was fascinating. Thank you very much indeed, and inspiring. Thank you.
I'm delighted to join Rector Verona in expressing Bocconi's great satisfaction for the agreement between LSE and Bocconi on the double degree actually, in European and international public policy and politics. I'm very grateful to Dame Minouche and to Professor Featherstone for having steered with great will, as there has been on our side, this process. I believe it might have happened even without Brexit, but if Brexit has heartened further our motivations, then this will have to be accounted among, I believe, the not too long list of positives from Brexit. I will briefly touch upon 3 points. What are the concrete lessons so far that one can draw from Brexit? By the way, on the causes of Brexit and many other things, I completely share Minouche's very persuasive analysis. But what are some lessons that one can draw from that experience so far? Secondly, what will be the landscape of the European Union's economic policies after Brexit? And thirdly, what will be the political landscape of the European Union after the European elections, particularly once Brexit has been completed? Well, on the first point, concrete lessons from Brexit, I see putting ourselves particularly in the perspective of a country like Italy, but I believe more broadly as well. I see in particular 3 angles of drawing lessons and warnings. One is the risks of using direct democracy methods when applied to highly complex issues. The referendum was used in 2016, unquestionably applied to an extremely complex issue about the remain or leave, and it was done in spite of all the good work. In particular, I have in mind the thick couple of volumes from Her Majesty's Treasury on the consequences of a possible Brexit at the time. But the analysis of what might be the consequences of Brexit and the various modalities of Brexit was nowhere close to what was needed to inform the decisions of a country. And what we saw has been that the country which we have been admiring and envying, certainly for decades, for its unique degree of pragmatism, for its perfect seamless continuity between the universities, the think tanks, the empirical analysis on the ground, the information to and the work within the public administration, the link between the public administration advice and the politicians' decisions, all that was so perfect that, for example, we in the continent have been trying to draw from that and the American experience, setting up think tanks, consultative papers. We have imitated their method of arriving at well-informed decision-making. Well, that has left and has given place, I say it with friendly admiration now for the resilience of that great country, to a total mess and disarray with the total disarticulation going from the top of the political system to the ordinary people. For example, the marvelous link between political power in London and the city and British industry, a continuum of power which had for many decades had the consequence, for example, of easily dividing the rest of the EU in discussions in Brussels, all that has suddenly evaporated. And we are now confronted with a political system which is at pains in making any decision. The second lesson is cynicism in using Europe for domestic political purposes. I believe that David Cameron, whom I admired and was a good friend of, will remain in the history books, not for the reasons any statements might wish to remain in history books, because there is an example to the extreme of a pattern followed in reality by many, many government leaders of European countries in the last several years. Namely, how dangerous it is and how cynical it is to use Europe for domestic political purposes. When David Cameron decided to call a referendum, it was obviously not in the general interest of Europe, almost obviously, but clearly not either in the general interest of the UK, not even in the general interest of the Conservative Party, I'm afraid, but in the interest of him trying to strengthen his hold on the Conservative Party. Look at the consequences and the disruptions that are probably there to stay for years and centuries. He's by no means the only one, but I like to think of other very rare templates of politicians in Europe. There is one, like Helmut Kohl, who lost power in his national elections in 1998 in Germany, because he put the interest of Europe, which he saw inextricably linked to the interest of a united Europe, in front of his personal convenience. He was defeated by Schröder, who at that time did not want a single currency, but Kohl, with his determination, finally had the single currency for Germany and Europe. And I think his place in history is not going to be worse than the one of David Cameron, for sure. And then a lesson also interesting for this country, how difficult it is to leave Europe, to leave to leave the European Union. It has been very difficult for countries to, except for the happy founding fathers, happy few, to join the European Union, with all a series of different approximations, tasks, demonstrations to give of being prepared, etc., etc. But how difficult it is to leave the EU. Well, I don't need to spend words on the current Brexit experiment of leaving, which is the first one being played out in concrete reality. But let me just bring the attention of my fellow Italians to what was said many times 1 or 2 years ago by one and the other of the parties which now shape Italy's majority, namely, I must say, with candid and even nice naivete, saying publicly, well, we will ask for better conditions for Italy in the treaties or in the policies. And if ever we will be unable to get them, we will leave, Italy will leave the Eurozone or the European Union. Well, number one, it's not that the UK has achieved enormously in terms of bargaining power because of a threat of leaving. And I'm not sure that our rampant, nicely disorderly political system would be able to display the same empire-like ability to negotiate displayed unsuccessfully by Her Majesty's government. Coming more quickly to my second point, the EU economic policy without the UK. I am sure, personally, I'm afraid that the Brexit will be a big, big loss operation, both for the UK, but also for the European Union, for broad political and strategic and civilization reasons, but also because I'm afraid the policy making of the EU without the annoying and stubborn UK minister at the table of the Council will be less good. Will no doubt be easier and simpler, but less good. Well, we want Europe, so says the Treaty of Lisbon, to be a highly competitive social market economy. And certainly the market is by no means the only element of that, but is the first basic platform. And the single market in particular. Now, we should all remember that the single market has been, more than anything else, a British construction in the late 80s, led intellectually and politically by Margaret Thatcher and her Commissioner for the Internal Market in Brussels in the Delors Commission, Lord Cockfield. And how great a paradox it is, Minouche, isn't it, that it should be a British conservative government to take away from itself its so highly successful export product to the rest of Europe, which is the single market, a state of things for which we discovered on this occasion, we forgot about that, the Norwegians, for example, are paying huge amounts of money each year to be able to play economically in it. Well, having said that, the champion in EU policy making, the champion for well-functioning markets, for competition, for opening, for structural reform, for not being shy vis-à-vis the challenges of globalization, has always been the UK. I have been commissioner first for the single market, then for competition. I hated some discussions with the British Prime Minister or Chancellor of the Exchequer on particular points, because they are, as Lord Cockfield, who was already an old man, when I visited him in London, having taken his job in Brussels, I remember he said to me, "You should never forget that we Brits are brutal." I was a bit shocked by that expression, which is not entirely unfounded. And so it may be difficult to deal with them, but certainly the intellectual and political forces which has driven most consistently in European policy making the motives of the market, of competition, etc., has been the UK. Now, without the UK, I can visualize the things. For the commissioners at the Commission table wanting to bring more market and competition in Europe, it will be a bit more difficult, not being able to count on the alliance of the British Commissioner. Same thing in the Council, same thing in the Parliament. And there is a risk, I believe, maybe it is already a bit visible, that Germany and France, on occasions, in fact, with the help of Italy, although Italy might believe that it is not helping, but might be helping in fact, retrenching a bit towards neo-corporatism, which would make the competitiveness of Europe even more difficult to improve. Last, politics at the EU level after the European elections. Here I want to round off with a note, probably unfounded, but of optimism. There will be the European elections, no doubt, according to any polls, that the sovereignist parties in all countries in different variations will come up strongly. No poll at the moment suggests that they might put together, earn a majority in the European Parliament, also because we will discover soon that the preferences of the more or less pro-Europe parties can be aggregated, but not the preferences of the sovereigntist parties, because they could be aggregated on issues like reducing the powers of Brussels or making the borders of Europe totally closed to anybody. But then their platform is a nationalistic platform, and therefore, by definition, they will be at odds with each other. But at any rate, the making European policies will be more difficult, even more difficult than in the past, because the Popular Party, the Socialist Party, the Liberals and the Greens, and probably it will take 3 or 4 of these to form a majority, will be in a weaker position than previously. But why I speak of optimism? Well, because in my, no doubt, excessive confidence in competition, I believe that competition helps even political systems to stay in good health. I am convinced that capitalism, for example, has delivered better outcomes, has been more measured, more self-restrained, more performant, until it had more or less a challenger, the communist system. When it lost the challenger and became a monopolist, then the excesses of capitalism, of short-termism, of financial capitalism as an end for itself, etc., became more evident, unchecked, brought to the great financial and economic crisis, and may again bring to that, maybe. So what has this to do with the European Union? What I imagine in my rare moments of optimism, but a day like this, of course, is definitely among those, is that playing in retrospect, maybe one day we will say that pro-Europeanism, when it was an unquestioned majority force in the European Parliament and in Europe, brought to some excesses, like the EU maybe intruding in too much details in domestic affairs, etc., etc. But then, ever since the sovereignist challenge came up strongly, historians will say after May 2019, Europeanism has been forced to look more deeply into itself, to separate what is essential from what is redundant in the European construction, and maybe being challenged by an opposing force has become more vital and has brought to a better synthesis on what the European Union is, and maybe, but this would be going a bit too far, if this improvement through the challenge of sovereignism were to be really there, visible and positive, maybe the UK from out there might one day consider making use again of some odd form of decision-making to see that on the lines strongly asserted in 2019 by LSE and Bocconi, it could reapproach the European Union with a more open mind. Thank you very much.